I'm the chair of a very dedicated committee that planned today's informative program. I'm so happy to see you all here in person for this very timely and important topic of wise aging and end-of-life planning. We also have many people on Zoom with us today from all over the Sacramento region, Berkeley, Sebastopol, Los Angeles, San Diego, New Jersey, and Florida. Welcome to you as well. Please, those of you on Zoom, mute your mics. Thank you very much. And all of you who have registered will receive a link to today's recorded program within a couple of weeks. Couple of housekeeping reminders. Please turn off your cell phones now if you haven't already done so. There is complimentary water in the foyer, and the restrooms are to the right when you exit the sanctuary. It is my great pleasure to introduce Rabbi Nancy Wexler, who will lead us in a prayer for Israel.
Good afternoon. Could I have everybody stand, please? Avinu Shabashamayim, Sur Yisrael v'Goalo, Barech et Medinat Yisrael, Reshit Tzimichat Geulatenu, Hagen Aleha be'evrat chostecha, Ufros Aleha Sukat Shlomecha, Ushlach Orcha va'amitecha l'rashecha, Sareha v'yoatzeha, V'tagnem be'etzah tova milfanecha, V'natata shalom ba'aretz, V'simchat olam liyoshvecha v'nomar amen. O Heavenly One, Protector and Redeemer, bless the state of Israel, which marks the dawning of hope for all who seek peace. Shield it beneath the wings of your love, spread over it the canopy of your peace. Send your light and truth to all who lead and advise, guiding them with your good counsel. Establish peace in the land for all inhabitants and fullness of joy for all who dwell there. Amen. Our brothers and sisters, the entire house of Israel, and all innocent victims who remain in distress and captivity, whether on sea or on land, may God have compassion on them all and bring them from distress to relief, from darkness to light. In this moment, speedily, very soon. Together we say, Amen. So please be seated. I am so glad that your programming is continuing. I'm so grateful that you are going to be learning and studying. And I know that we do so today with our hearts on all innocent in Israel, Gaza, Palestine. So I hope that we also dedicate your learning and your fellowship and your sisterhoodness and NCJW as we dedicate this also to bring light to a place of great darkness. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Rabbi Nancy. I want to thank our sponsors and supporters for bringing you today's program. Congregation Beth Shalom in Carmichael, California, hosting us in such a bright, inviting space to meet and discuss and learn, so appropriate in a spiritual and traditional gathering place. The National Council of Jewish Women, Sacramento Section, the Jewish Federation of the Sacramento Region, Jewish Family Service, and the Ann and Al Heisenberg Jewish Family Service Fund. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. You all have a handout. Please notice on the back page, you have room for notes. And maybe you brought extra paper for that. Also, there's an insert for a survey of today's program, and you can leave that on your seats when you exit. And there's also an index card, and hopefully all of you have that too. You can fill this out if you want to ask questions from the floor and do not want to stand up. Lynn Dean will be collecting those. Those of you on Zoom will have an opportunity to put your questions in the chat room. The questions will be restated and the speakers will answer as many as possible in 45 minutes. All questions will be used to plan our next session in February 2024. More on that later. And now, why are we here today? The new year is a time of fresh beginnings, and it's also a good time to plan for the end. Advanced care planning for aging and dying according to your stated wishes is a loving statement for the people you care about. Planning for a health crisis, long illness, or the end of life does not have to be upsetting. There can be great feeling in organizing your requests, knowing that being prepared will guide your family and other loved ones. It's an act of love. It's a different way of reframing planning for the end of your life. And end-of-life planning and aging isn't just about wills and funerals. It's also a reflection of your values, your goals for healthy aging and compassionate care. Advanced health directives are essential and should be created when you're healthy, not from a hospital bed. That's why we're here today. Very few Americans think about how they want to age and die. People in other countries are way ahead of us. Before modern medical treatments and longer lives, it didn't matter because there were few options. But in the 20th century, modern medicine made it possible to extend life and postpone death by relying on antibiotics, surgery, dialysis, chemotherapy, and life-sustaining equipment. Now we can choose to fight and postpone death or accept our fates. We have options. Most often, people choose to fight without considering alternatives, and the medical community usually doesn't volunteer options. The quality of life after prolonged treatments needs to be discussed with compassion, honesty, and respect. Compassion and Choices, the nation's oldest, largest, and most active nonprofit organization working to improve care and expand options since 1980, says, quote, "They envision a society that affirms life and accepts the inevitability of death, embraces expanded options for compassionate dying, and empowers everyone to choose end-of-life care that reflects their values, their priorities, and their beliefs. Aging and dying people should be able to retain their integrity, dignity, and self-respect. Today, you will be given information about your options to make decisions for treatment and medical care and to find your own informed path to aging and dying. You will hear how to be your own advocate, to be assertive, to know your options. You have the final decision to decide if treatment is always the answer or curing isn't always the answer. You will learn more about negotiating our complicated healthcare system. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers who will share their knowledge, expertise, and stories about their patients' experiences with aging and dying. After their remarks, they will answer as many questions as possible. Ryan? Dr. Ryan Spielvogel is Medical Director of End-of-Life Option Act Services for Sutter Health, where he teaches and sets policy and quality standards around the practice of medical aid in dying. He has helped numerous patients understand facts and feelings concerning their own care. Chaplain Meg McClaskey is currently the chaplain and bereavement counselor at UC Davis Hospice. She has a PhD in medical ethics. Meg has journeyed with many patients and families through making decisions that are compatible with their beliefs and values. Meg and Ryan, thank you so much for sharing your vast experience and knowledge with us today. Please be seated.
Hello.
I've been told we have to swallow the mics in order for you to be able to hear, so.
You want to go first or me?
Your name's first, but I'll go first.
Okay, all right.
Go ahead.
I can
Go
go
ahead.
first. We just wanted to briefly introduce how we became interested in end-of-life care as kind of our intro. So I became interested in end-of-life care and palliative care specifically, a little backwards. So I never thought that I would be interested in end-of-life care as a doctor until the End-of-Life Option Act came along in California, which I'm going to talk in more detail about later. But during my interactions with patients over the years with that, it became very clear to me how powerful these conversations can be at the end of life and discussing options with people, no matter what they end up deciding, that those conversations are incredibly powerful and meaningful to have with individuals and as a doctor. And so started to gravitate more towards that side of medicine as time went on. It's an honor to be able to have those kinds of conversations with people. And as was brought up by Lydia, it's not always something that doctors offer right away to talk about these options. So sometimes it's the first time people have heard them.
So my path has been a little more personal. Back in the 1980s, I was diagnosed with a terminal illness and had experimental surgery and basically had, except for the fact that I was in theological school at the time, had very little support, had very little explanation of any of the choices that I was making. My parents and my sister, because my sister was a nurse, got in an argument over what care I would get, and it was kind of not a good thing. And I became a chaplain. And then when I was living in Chicago, one of my dearest friends lived in Phoenix, and she called me to tell me that she had been diagnosed with lung cancer. And she said, there are no books out there to tell me how to do this. She said, everybody's giving me Tuesdays with Maury. And that's about the living. And she said, I don't even know how to talk to my children. Will you come? So I took leave and went to Arizona to be with her until she passed. And then my dear rabbi in Chicago had a very severe Parkinson's, and people no longer would listen to him. He had a very thick accent. He was had gotten out prior to the Holocaust, and he said to me once, people used to listen to me, and now they ask me a question and walk away, because he took a long time to find his thoughts. I was with him through to the end of his life and with his family. They were in Chicago, my family. They were my mishpacha, and that's how I ended up doing this work, is because it's just deeply, profoundly important to me that we be there for people during this time, so they can be heard, so they can sort out what they want and how they want it. So. Yeah. So I think the first definition is mine. We want to make sure that we've got some sense of what the definitions are as we go into this conversation. So how many of you have heard the word palliative care? How many of you know what it is? Oh, okay. So I'm going to give a short, brief answer. And that is that palliative care often gets confused with hospice. And hospice indeed provides palliative care, but you can have palliative care without hospice. So palliative care is symptom management, and it is the managing of all of the issues that come either with treatment, but usually in the context of a life-threatening illness, but somebody who doesn't quite yet qualify for hospice or is still deciding to have ongoing treatment. And so they're still pursuing treatment, but they need to have their symptoms managed. I'm doing all of these?
Just hospice.
Huh?
Then I'm doing these.
Okay, I guess I'm doing all the definitions. So hospice then is a very set of criteria. It didn't start that way. It started in England and it was volunteer organizations that came in and helped the dying, but eventually got taken in by Medicare, who created very strict criteria of what it means to be in hospice. And the original diagnosis has to be that the expectation would be that someone would die within 6 months and that they have decided to no longer pursue treatment, or that treatment is no longer appropriate, or, chemo's not working anymore. And there are a lot of financial frameworks around hospice. And so people have to be recertified every 6 months, or actually more often than that. We kind of look at them at the beginning, it's every 6 months, and then it cuts down to a shorter period of time. People can re-up, so you don't have to die in 6 months to be in hospice. But as long as they still meet the criteria that they're declining, that they're not receiving treatment, and that they wish to continue with this support. Hospice provides, there's always a medical director, there are nurses, there are social workers, there's the chaplain. Some of them, UC Davis has physical therapists that go out to teach families how to do care. And so there's a lot of dynamics that happen within hospice in terms of overall supportive care. How many of you have heard of EOLOA or MAID?
That one's me.
That's you. Okay. I'm still going to ask the question.
Yeah.
How many of you have heard of EOLOA or MAID? EOLOA means End of Life Option Act. How many of you have heard of that? Okay. So Ryan is now going to share with you what that means in this context.
Yeah, and by the way, I wanted to, there's a helpful thing that I feel like a lot of people don't realize about hospice, if I may add something, which is how it's paid for.
Yeah.
Because that actually dictates a lot of these questions that a lot of people end up getting when they're on hospice. So it's paid for through the Medicare benefit. When somebody elects to go on hospice and enroll in hospice, they're relinquishing their Medicare Part B coverage. That's how hospice is paid for. And that has implications for what you can then do and access once you're on hospice. So people will say, like, what do you mean I can't see my oncologist anymore? Well, it's because being on hospice, that's paid for through those outpatient benefits. So you can't get certain treatments anymore because of that.
Yeah, I would add to that, like we have a gentleman right now who wants radiation therapy.
Yeah.
If it was palliative and just to remediate his pain, hospice might pay for it. Depends what hospice you're in. But if it's in fact because he wants to shrink that tumor, because he wants to be able to do something, or he's still looking at it as treatment, he would have to revoke from hospice and go off hospice and maybe come back on after he had the treatment.
Yeah.
So
just thought I'd put that out there, because that oftentimes confuses people.
Huge.
What do you mean I can't do that anymore? And it's because, well, that's how hospice is paid for out of those benefits. Okay, so End of Life Option Act. Saw a few hands go up for people who had heard of that before. The End of Life Option Act is a law that was passed went into effect in California in 2016. And what it did was it authorized the medical process of MAID. MAID is MAID, stands for Medical Aid in Dying, or medically assisted death, or physician assisted death. There's a bunch of different names for it. But the End of Life Option Act made it legal in California. And medical aid in dying is the process by which a terminally ill, mentally competent individual can consider taking a lethal dose of medication to help end their suffering sooner. So what that did when it became legal in California was it added on another option. So before this, we had just keep doing everything, as Lydia had talked about, which kind of oftentimes becomes sort of the assumed standard. Then there's hospice care, palliative care, hospice care, and now people have another option in California after the End of Life Option Act entered the scene. And it's important to note that people can pursue different avenues all at once. Oftentimes when I see people who are considering medical aid in dying, they're in hospice or not even in hospice yet, and they want to keep their options open in case things get to the point where they're like, no, I'm done. There are a variety of reasons why people choose to consider medical aid in dying. And most of the time, people don't have just one reason. Oftentimes, what I hear from people is some version of, I took care of my mom or my dad when he or she had metastatic cancer. I saw what that end looks like, and I don't want to get to X point. Because at that point, I know for myself, I won't have quality of life anymore. And I don't want to live that last month or two confined to a bed, what have you. Or it might be, I don't ever want to get to the point where I can't clean myself up and my family has to clean up after me. It is very fascinating how oftentimes that is the line in the sand for a lot of people. Because I ask, I'm very curious, but it's also part of my way of assessing their judgment to say, what is that point for you? You don't have to have a definite answer there, but I want to know, what is your thought process behind all this? And what is your line in the sand? There's no right or wrong answer to that because it's very individual. But oftentimes people will say, when my family has to wipe my butt, I'm done. Interestingly, it's almost a direct quote from many conversations I've had. Okay, that's medical aid in dying.
The other big reason, though, is often that people don't want to suffer.
Yes.
I mean, people who are in pain and in extremis, and it's not easy for hospice or whoever to manage, and
Yep.
they just can't abide it anymore. That's another reason. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's all this very complex interplay between thoughts of dignity, thoughts of self-worth, thoughts of what you get meaning out of, and thoughts of suffering and what suffering constitutes to you. Because not all suffering is physical. And for a lot of people at the end of life, they have a variety of different forms of suffering. Physical can just be one of them. And also part of why it's important to be asking people what it is they're afraid of at the end of life, right? Because this is all about, I don't want to X. So part of the importance of talking about that is there's oftentimes things that I uncover in those conversations that maybe we can palliate, maybe we can effectively alleviate, and maybe they just haven't had the courage to bring that up to their providers before. There have been a number of times, for instance, where somebody's brought up to me pain control as, the reason that they want to go this route. And it might be that they need more effective pain control. And I've talked with their hospice about it, and we've come up with different strategies for better mitigating their pain or alleviating their pain. And then they never come back and see me because we were able to address their concerns about end of life care. And they decided that aid in dying wasn't actually what they needed. Somebody who came to me once who had end stage kidney disease and had horrible symptoms when he was on hospice, on hemodialysis. And so went off of hemodialysis and then lingered for much longer than he was expecting, and everyone was expecting the entire time, getting more and more debilitated. And when I talked with him, there were other options beyond hemodialysis that apparently had not been discussed with him. And so when I brought that up with him, he was like, yes, I would love to try something else. I want to live. This is the other thing. Nobody comes to this wanting to die. Everyone who I've evaluated for aid in dying, if given the option to continue to live without their suffering, they all want that. But that's unfortunately not an option anymore for most of them. So this gentleman decided, after he had heard of this other option called peritoneal dialysis, he wanted to try that. And so that was our solution there, was we got him in this other form of treatment, and he then didn't need this. So these conversations aren't all about, here, let me help you plan your death. It does sometimes turn into, well, let's help you live better in a way that is consistent with your desires. Okay. So I should also mention the End of Life Option Act, a couple of processes. It's not a very simple process. It has a lot of different pieces to it so that we can be sure that the people who are accessing this are really the people who need to be accessing this. So first of all, everyone has to have a prognosis of 6 months or less. So a terminal condition, 70.
And it may not be the same as the hospice one.
Yes.
We've had people on hospice get turned down.
Yep.
For using the End of Life Option Act. So.
Yeah, and that gets very confusing to
Yes.
people, because both the hospice eligibility criteria and medical aid in dying criteria is the same wording: prognosis, a terminal condition with a prognosis of 6 months or less. So when someone comes to us where we are legally required to do an independent assessment of your prognosis, and we might disagree, there's then a lot of, well, then the hospice told me that I'm in hospice. What do you mean I don't have a prognosis of 6 months or less? And the way that I think of that is, and a lawyer friend of mine would hate me saying this, but there's a little bit of a different bar for the burden of evidence, I feel like, a little bit. For people who are going on hospice, they can get decertified from hospice. They can go off of hospice. And so I feel like there's a little bit of a lower hurdle for me to say, yeah, sure, okay, you're eligible for hospice. You probably have a 6-month prognosis. I want to be a little bit more certain when I am certifying someone for the End of Life Option Act. Now that's maybe a little bit fuzzy, but that might be why we end up disagreeing.
Yeah.
And which gets a lot of people upset when we disagree with them.
But it's not so uncommon.
Yeah, it's not uncommon. And then what I tell people is this is based on a single determination at a single point in time. So in a couple of months, if things deteriorate, you come back and we can evaluate you again, because that's the nature of this, right? Is things change over time. If you are truly declining, you will.
Well, and it may be that they're not, and that they might
then
be
they get
discharged or call
decertified.
it graduate from
Yeah.
hospice.
So that comes up. And then mental capacity. So this is a difference between hospice eligibility and medical aid in dying eligibility, is you have to have capacity to make your own medical decisions, meaning you have to show me that you know what you're asking for, you know what your options are, and you can tell me why you're choosing this over this. Or it can be conditional. I want to do this, but when things get bad or get to this point, I'm going to switch to this. I need to know what your choices are, and you need to be able to tell me a little bit as to why. I don't have to agree with all of your explanations, but they need to be based in reality. They need to be somewhat reasonable. And also another difference between eligibility between medical aid and dying and hospice is hospice, like I said about that payment piece, you're revoking your rights to other access to medical or access to certain forms of medical care. With aid in dying, you're not, because it's not paid for the same way. And so when somebody might still be pursuing active treatment with chemotherapy, for instance. But I can tell this person has metastatic cancer. They actually do, even with the chemo, have a prognosis of 6 months or less. So they can become certified for aid in dying, even if they're not on hospice yet. That being said, I usually strongly encourage someone before they're actually going to consider taking the aid in dying medications to think really hard about that and get enrolled in hospice. But that's a different story. Okay, I think I'll move on from that for now. I'm going to get back to some stories about that later. Just to put a cap on our definitions, who here has heard of VSED or VSED? We figured there would be fewer hands to that one. There's one. So VSED is voluntary stopping of eating and drinking. Voluntary stopping of eating and drinking. And that is a process that somebody who is terminally ill, has mental capacity, might make the decision to stop eating and drinking to help hasten their death. It is highly variable how long that can take, anywhere from a few days up to a few weeks. It can actually be a quite difficult process for people to go through, and oftentimes people try it a few times before they get all the way to the end. That is oftentimes done while someone is actively enrolled in hospice, and there's different protocols and things out there to help somebody with that process if they so choose it. I've had a few patients go through VSED who, for whatever reason, didn't want aid in dying or didn't want to just do hospice until they passed on their own. And it's somewhat variable in terms of experience with it. Meg, you've had people with VSED, right?
Well, yeah, and actually, interestingly enough, most commonly in the Hindu tradition, where in the Jain tradition, where people will do that when they know that they are terminal. And it started out at the priest's level, and then people went, well, if they can do it, so can we. But yeah, I have been traveled that journey with a few people, several people, and a lot depends. It helps if they're in hospice because the symptoms and the difficulties with it can be managed more easily. But it's a difficult choice. And I think it was more common prior to the End of Life Option Act, where people then had the option to use medication.
Yeah. Okay. So next, we're going to move on to talk a little bit about the differences between disease-directed care and comfort-directed care, because this is also something that people sometimes get a little confused with. So we've been talking about hospice and palliative care and people kind of transitioning their thought process from going, one way to another. And oftentimes as clinicians, we are thinking about it in terms of disease-directed care versus comfort-directed care. And the distinction is, am I treating you as a person and your symptoms, or am I trying to treat and beat back the cancer? And I'm using cancer as an example. You can substitute that for any serious life-threatening condition. But for instance, in cancer, I might be doing radiation, chemo, surgery with the hopes of getting rid of the cancer. That oftentimes comes with a level of aggressiveness to our interventions where we are willing to sacrifice personal comfort and maybe even create some extra symptoms, some extra, call them side effects, some extra side effects or complications from our treatment because we're doing it for a reason. We're trying to beat the cancer, get the cancer to go away. But there comes a time where cure isn't an option anymore, oftentimes with cancer, if we're not able to beat it and it spreads. And it's actually not a death sentence for a lot of cancers anymore, that if it is metastatic, it is incurable. With the rise of immunotherapy, there actually are certain cancers where once they're metastatic, we actually can still cure them now. But to a large degree, if it's spread and we know as a physician, as a medical community, that it can no longer be cured, then our mental calculus of what we're going to offer and what we're going to do changes or should change. Because at that point, if we're not able to cure it anymore, then that whole basic assumption of let's do really intensive interventions, being willing to sacrifice comfort, cause complications, all those things, that was for the purpose of us trying to cure it. So if that purpose is no longer an option, we change what we're doing so that we're no longer doing disease-directed care. So things like chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, antibiotics, IV fluids, all these things can be either symptom-directed or comfort-directed, or they can be disease-directed, depending on what you're doing. But we as physicians have to always keep that in mind. And sometimes it can be very confusing to patients as well, because chemotherapy, for instance, we can use different cocktails of medications to try to help symptoms, maybe shrink a tumor here with radiation to help improve your symptoms if we're not doing it to the very high doses that might also cause extra side effects and complications. So sometimes radiation treatment can be palliative. Sometimes chemotherapy can be palliative. But oftentimes the patient may not realize that it's palliative and say, well, my doctor is still treating me with chemo, so there must still be a chance that I'm going to get through this and survive. And that's oftentimes where I'm having to break bad news to people that are like, well, no. Did they not talk with you? You're getting palliative chemo. Your oncologist does not think that you're going to be able to beat this back, but sometimes that's not always communicated to patients. My least favorite saying is we can't cure it, but we can treat it. What does that mean? That means nothing.
It's nothing.
But I hear that all the time from my patients. Well, my doctor told me that we can't cure it, but we can treat it. I am a doctor and I don't know what that statement means. And patients certainly don't know what it means either. And then I have to break the bad news to them that like, no, they're trying to treat your symptoms, but the cancer is unfortunately going to take your life. And that then changes our framing for what we're doing. Whether you really want to be strapped into a chair a few times a week to get chemo. If you're having side effects from your chemo, maybe you shouldn't tolerate those anymore and just soldier through, because that's kind of not the point of it anymore, is to just soldier through for the hopes of beating back the cancer. So it changes how we think about things once we migrate from disease-directed to comfort-directed.
I think one of the other lines that just irks me of a parallel is the number of people that come into hospice. The very day before they came into hospice, they were told by their doctor, your treatment's no longer working, and so we're going to suggest that you go into hospice. Somebody has to have known long before that day that was coming. And they're reeling. They have no idea what they were what does hospice mean? What's happening to me? So that's the other bane for me. The other thing that can happen is for someone like, I have a patient right now who has lung cancer. She had, her son-in-law died of lung cancer, but he didn't. He died from his chemo. And so she opted. She said, I don't want that. I am hypersensitive to every medication on the world. I'm not going through chemo. So she didn't receive treatment up to, and they said, oh, well, then you have to go into hospice. And we have increased her quality of life. Her family's all been able to come visit. She's not in a hospital bed. She's not got those side effects. So that was a choice she made to not have the chemo at all to begin with. But that the comfort palliative care attract the comfort care that hospice provides. And some people don't go into hospice, their families do this. I mean, I think in my family, families did this, family members, people died at home and they were taken care of. And we've created now this Medicare paid for element where we can provide so many levels of care. Some of it's medication, but some of it is social worker or the chaplain helping a person to deal with what the suffering it is, what it means to give up the control, to have somebody, and I'll use the crude and not just the clean up after you, wipe your butt. People don't want to get to that point. And what is it that the family is willing or able to do? And hopefully we can come around. Hospice is limited. We don't have somebody in the house all the time. We're just there for part of the time we're there. Nurses are there a couple times a week, and chaplains may be there once a week or maybe there once a month, depending upon the family's needs. They may be getting that support from their faith community. But comfort care is a wraparound of a much larger that includes using pain meds for medication, that includes teaching meditation practices to lower anxiety so you don't have to take so much anxiety med. Being with people in this process, helping them to learn how to talk to their families. So comfort care is really a big envelope of what it is that we provide in the context of hospice.
Yeah.
And now Ryan's going to share with you a little bit about how you can talk to your doctors about all this and the decision making, because both Ryan and I are really clear that this conversation often is not prompted by and started by our primary physicians or by our oncologists or by our COPD doc or pulmonologist. And so it really helps to be an advocate and know how to say to a doctor, hey, what are my, even ask that question, what are my options? So Ryan's going to talk a little bit more about how to do that.
Yeah, so we're supposed to, your primary care doctors are supposed to talk with you about this. It's part of the Medicare wellness visit that probably a lot of people in here have been to. So there are two, I would say, main times where you should really be thinking about end of life planning. The first is right now. So when you go and see your doctor to fill out something, and Meg's going to talk with you a little bit about some documents, something called an advance directive. An advance directive is where you spell out things like who you want your surrogate medical decision maker to be, or what your desires are at the end of life. And it's very broad. It's a broad document. It's taking in the general, not the specific. It's really it's the if I get hit by a bus scenario. So something catastrophic happens and you're not really able to communicate for yourself what you would want. You should tell us now on this piece of paper what it is you would want in that scenario. Who's going to be making decisions for you, and to what extent do you want interventions to be done on your behalf? That's time one to be thinking about this and talking with your doctor. And then there's the more specific. So I think it was Benjamin Franklin, somebody's gonna correct me if I'm wrong, that said nothing in life is certain except for death and taxes. Or maybe it was Thomas Jefferson. I should have looked this up before I said it. And yet everyone is surprised when death comes knocking at their door. We all know that it's going to happen to all of us, but yet most of us are not prepared for it when it does. So when we all get what eventually will become the thing that gets us, when we get that serious life-threatening condition, we're diagnosed with cancer for the first time, or we're diagnosed with Parkinson's or ALS or any of these other things that we're like, okay, I need to know more about where this is going and what I want to do. That's a really good time to have this conversation with your doctor before you get too far down the road. And maybe that isn't the road that you're going to go down. Maybe this is something that is actually curable, and your doctor says, whoa, 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 hold on. Let's not get too far down that path. This is a curable cancer or what have you. But that's a really good time to start having that conversation with your doctor before the momentum starts building in this direction and you're already down that path, and you have your oncologist and your radiation oncologist and your surgical oncologist, and you're not seeing your primary care doctor anymore because you have 15 other appointments crammed into a month. And then the next time you see your primary care, this is a real scenario, right? Then the next time you see your primary care doctor is 3 years later, and they say, "Oh my gosh, what happened to you?" You don't want that to be the case. You want to start talking with your doctor who you've known for a long time before you get too in that rut, and say, before I go down this path, I need to know from you, what does the future hold? What is this going to look like? I realize that there are different possibilities and you can't predict the future, but what is this going to look like? And what are my options? And when should I switch paths? Because that's a conversation you should have at the beginning, not when your primary care doctor is seeing you after 3 years and saying, "Oh my God, what happened to you?" Okay, so bring it up with them when you are diagnosed with a serious life-threatening, potentially life-threatening condition, and lay it out. Because then that clues your doctor in to become that advocate on your behalf. Because you might not have medical training and you might not know when you get to these points, but your primary care doctor does, and is going to be then watching, and is going to be then communicating with your oncologist or your neurologist and asking questions along the way, because Meg told me that she does not want to get to this point. And I'm reading from the notes that it looks like this is kind of where we're at. Can you confirm that for me? And so that then we can then reach out to you and say, hey, let's meet and talk. So that's why it's very helpful. I did have a patient that is coming to mind where this happened to, or he was my patient for several years, and then he disappeared and I didn't see him for about 2 years. And then he came to see me because he had metastatic cancer and had a doctor at a different institution that I won't name here. And had 5 different doctors there treating this, and I hadn't seen him for a couple of years, and he was coming to see me for a hospital follow-up because he had been admitted for the 3rd time this year with complications from his chemo. And he had incurable cancer. And no one had had that conversation with him about, why are we still doing this like this? If you have incurable cancer, why do you want to be spending half of the rest of your life in the hospital from complications from the treatments? So important to talk with your primary care doctor and check in with them and tell them to be honest with you. We'll be honest with you if you want us to be honest with you. Oh, one more thing. The other person who you have to have this conversation with is the person that you write down on your advance directive as your surrogate decision maker. So that's not just you write down the name and you forget about it. That is, you write down the name, and well, actually first, before you write down that name, you talk to that person and you say, this is what I want you to do or not to do if I get hit by a bus. Are you going to honor my wishes? Yes. Are you okay with me putting your name down here? You're not going to just, blow off the doctors and run away when they try to call you and say, I've been hit by a bus. Yes. Okay. Then you write that name down. So the other very important person to talk with your wishes about is your surrogate decision maker. Okay.
And I would add that not just your primary, each one of the doctors you
Yes.
encounter, it's worth having that conversation with and taking that position that you want to know what's going on and you want to know more about this disease and more about what their plans are and where that might take you. That those questions that Ryan has brought up are really integrally important to your medical care all the way through any process. Quick on, really to be sure to do that. And when you saw me writing while he was talking, I wrote, tell your decision maker. So there are a number of end of life documents out there. How many of you have a living will? So who do you think would enforce your living will or follow through and make the decisions based on it? There's no designee on a living will of who that might be. So the document that you want to have is a durable power of attorney for healthcare. And a durable power of attorney for healthcare designates a primary. You can't have all your kids on there. It has to be somebody, and then that person can communicate with the rest of the family or make the decision with the rest of the family, but it needs to be one person. And then you can have a second. So if that person's not available or is also sick or whatever, you need to have a second person. And what Ryan is saying is that those two people, critically important for you to have your conversation about what you want. The power of attorney for healthcare itself only has three options. I want everything done. I want nothing done. And what's the third one? I don't even know. But they're very simple, very basic, not easily interpretable in terms of what we want. So we're going to answer questions later. So but you can, and first time I handed mine to my doctor and went, here, an advanced directive. And an advanced directive can be much more specific about what you do and do not want going forward. And so we can be much more clear about I do want or I don't want hydration and nutrition, and I do and do not want to be. So mine is real clear. I know some people who, in fact, a dear friend of mine, who her daughters wanted her conscious. She was clear she did not want pain. And every time they would lift her consciousness, so she wasn't, so that they could communicate with her, she was back in extreme pain. Where she made that clear to me, she had not made it as clear to her daughters. And so they continued to do this, and they would lift her out. But so making your wishes clear about what you want at the end of life and those distinctions. So doctors will sometimes, and not Ryan, but some doctors will tell you, well, you have a so-and-so % chance that this is going to work. And that may be very low, but all you hear is that this could work. You don't hear the percentage. And you don't hear that the bigger percentage is that it's not going to. And what does it mean? Does it mean that I'm going to return to the life that I had, or that I'm going to be bedbound? And that's the life I will have going forward. And we need to clarify that kind of conversation with doctors and with our decision makers about what we are willing to pursue toward what goal. We spend a lot of time in hospice, and I know that Ryan does in his work, sorting out goals of care. And this is something for you to begin to think of now, of what would your goals be if you were sick? Is it to return to what you were, and that's not a possibility? Is it to be pain-free? Is it to be able to say your last goodbyes? Is it to make that last trip to Hawaii? Who knows? But what are your goals in terms of comfort and in terms of treatment? So that's an advanced directive. So we have a living will that's kind of can flesh that stuff out, but not to making anybody a decision maker. Durable power of attorney for healthcare that assigns a decision maker, and then an advanced directive that also should have a deep conversation around it with people. And we're going to, I think, do another session just on these forms, right? So one of the other forms that's out there that's wonderful, what's it called? 5 Wishes. 5 Wishes, you can purchase it online, and sometimes different organizations have copies of it, but it helps you think about it in terms of your values, in terms of what you believe and what you want. It's a significant form with some length to it. And some states have more values clarification things connected to their power of attorney for healthcare and their advanced directives. And then the last form that I want to talk about quickly, how are we on time? Oh dear,
Ooh.
we're at it. So the last form I want to talk about quickly is just the POLST form. How many of you have heard of a POLST form? Okay, so the POLST form is really, you have to have that life-ending illness in order to have one. That's when it gets filled out, and it determines whether or not you will be resuscitated. And the error in that is that the form says, if my heart stops and I stop breathing, do I want to be resuscitated? What it doesn't say, which I have fought for I don't know how long, since POLST came out, is if I'm dead, do you want to be resuscitated? Because if your heart is stopped, then you've stopped breathing, you're dead. So the question is, if I'm dead, do I want to be brought back? And will I be brought back to what I was? Or will I be brought back and I'm on a ventilator? Or will I be brought back and I'm in a nursing home and don't have my mind anymore? So a POLST form allows you to make those decisions that are binding. The reason they created POLST is it used to be, you could be a DNR in the hospital and in the ambulance on the way to the nursing home, you crashed and they would code you. The code is resuscitation process. So POLST was created to make a form that was across all parts of care, all the nursing home, the ambulance, your home, wherever. So if you have one and you're in your home, it gets put on the refrigerator, and it's the first place the paramedics look to see what you want. And it says whether you want resuscitation, you don't want resuscitation, but it also answers some questions about whether or not you want to be hospitalized or not. And it answers some questions about whether or not you want to receive hydration and nutrition. It's a very important document that has strong legal standing in terms of who's going to do what and make those decisions. So those are the basic forms that are out there. The POLST form's bright pink, so that people will see it and notice it. In some states, it's other colors. It's called other things in other states, MOLST and KOLST, and yeah. So I think that's the documents piece.
Okay, so I am going to share a story about how I got involved in medical aid in dying, since that is a less often talked about form of medical care. So when this law went into effect in 2016, the organization that I work for, Sutter Health, sent out an email in like February of that year. The law went into effect in June, went into effect in June. Yep. So they sent out an email to all of the 5,000 physicians under the Sutter Health umbrella in February or so that said, hey, this law is coming. We're not going to opt out. Oh, that's something else that you should talk with your doctor about.
Oh, man.
Because if this is something that you would ever consider, you need to ask your doctor, is that something I'd be able to get here? Because it's legal in California, but the law in California also allows physicians and whole institutions to opt out of offering it. And so there are some whole healthcare institutions where the doctors might say, I would if I could, but I can't. You are in X medical institution and this whole institution has opted out. I saw someone mouth the correct answer for which organization in our area is opted out. And hospices might also be opted out. And there's different levels of what it means to be opted out as a hospice organization. So They could say they're not going to care for you if you are wanting to do aid in dying. And I've had people basically be kicked out of hospices right at the very end because they insisted on doing aid in dying. And various policies that make it more difficult within certain hospices. Some hospices, the physicians participate, and some of them they don't. And so it might be you'd have to arrange for a physician outside of the hospice organization to actually provide the care for you.
Sometimes
So-
the hospice staff will wait outside until after you've taken the medication.
Yeah,
Go
that's
back
actually
in.
very common is the leave the room policies.
But-
Which, yes, anyway.
We don't all do that.
No. So, something else to ask your physician. I got myself off on a tangent. Okay, so they sent out this email saying this is coming. Sutter Health is not opting out of providing aid in dying, and so we want to know, show of hands, who's going to be comfortable doing this or would be interested in doing this. They had a bunch of different gradations from like, no way, no how, I don't want to have any part of it, to sure, I'll see my patients or other people's patients if they want to do this and their doctor can't or won't for whatever reason. Then like several different gradations in between. And I had literally never thought of it before, never learned about this in medical school or residency, other than the fact that there's this thing that they do in Oregon called Death with Dignity. And that was pretty much the extent of the conversation around it. And I thought, I have no idea how I would feel about this, but certainly if this is helping somebody, I'd be willing to give it a try. And, I'm sure most doctors would feel the same way. And, so if someone has the misfortune of having that one doctor that's opting out, like, sure, yeah, I'll see that person's patient. Why not? So I chose the most permissive option. Little did I know that I was one of 8 in the whole group of 5,000 who had chosen that option because I was young and naive. And so, June 9th, I think, of 2016 was the day it went into effect. And so on June 8th, I got an email from the person who would become like the system level coordinator and is now my direct partner, administrative partner in this, that said, you are one of our new aid in dying specialists. And so we have a backup of many referrals pending, people just waiting in the wings until this goes into effect. So what's your schedule look like? So I thought, oh my gosh. And so I saw my first patient for aid in dying the next week. And I had no idea how I was going to feel about this and just decided, all right, well, I just got to do one case and then sort out my feelings as I'm going and think about it afterwards to kind of just know if this is something I can or can't do moving forward. Merlin was a 90-year-old gentleman who came into my office. He also actually had end-stage kidney disease. Usually end-stage kidney disease is not a typical reason that people are seeking this. I'm just happening to tell 2 different stories having to do with it. And he had a similar story to the other gentleman that I mentioned, that he got on hemodialysis and he then felt awful. And I don't mean to bash hemodialysis. Hemodialysis is wonderful. It's wonderful life-saving treatment. But some people have some pretty significant side effects from it. And so he noticed that he was getting a lot of ups and downs with it. There were reasons that he couldn't do the other form of dialysis that I talked about. And it was like the day before, the day of, and the day after dialysis, he felt awful. And if you know anything about dialysis, that's all the time because you're doing it 3 times a week. So he took himself off of dialysis. He said, I've lived a good life. I'm going to take myself off. My kidney doctor tells me I'll be dead in a month. And he lasted for a year, slowly getting more and more uremic, which is a form of end-stage kidney disease or complication from end-stage kidney disease. And at that point, he used to play doubles tennis. He could barely walk anymore because of the crippling fatigue. Everything tasted like cardboard. He had this condition called dysgeusia, which, now everybody knows about because of COVID. Basically, he didn't have a sense of taste anymore. And he was just getting more and more debilitated. And I was just I had no idea what to expect. And I was so struck by how crystal clear he was with what he didn't want to experience. He knew where things were going and he didn't want to get there. And most of the time, I'm dealing with the opposite, people who are just in total denial about what's happening to them. They don't want to confront it, and I'm kind of having to hold their hand to help them confront it. And here's this guy who's like looking death straight in the face and was just very brave about how he was viewing his own life and his death. And I was just really caught off guard by it, honestly. And so I helped him through, and he ended up taking the medications about a week after he went through the whole process. And I talked with his daughter afterwards. I should have given my disclaimer at the beginning that I often get a little choked up with this story. I talked to his daughter afterwards, and she said something I'll never forget, which is, we had a memorial for Dad while he was still alive. All of his friends and family flew from out of town. We had a big party for him where he could be part of that party. We watched his favorite movies, listened to his favorite music, and then we all gathered outside on the porch with the sunset, and he took the drink, the medications, surrounded by friends and family, laid back, went to sleep, and died peacefully. Yeah. And I was like, oh. Yeah. And so I was hooked, I would say. This is not something that I really expected to be doing as a physician, but just seeing how incredibly powerful it was, not just for him, but for his family. They got to see him and remember him taking control of his dying process and making those decisions for himself and dying the way that he wanted to die, rather than what unfortunately many of us do remember of our loved ones passing, which is not so great. And so I just became a convert right then and there. So just want to share that story.
That kind of death is so common within the context of the use of MAID.
Yep.
Family gatherings, all kinds of interesting things. Someday I'll write a book.
Yeah. There's some very interesting family, having been at a few, there's some very interesting family dynamics.
Yeah, always. Lydia.
I hope I can get through this too, because I'd like to tell you about my sister Ellie. She was 3 years younger than I, and over the course of a lifetime, she became my best friend, my travel and theater companion, an accomplished golfer with 4 holes in one to her credit. And she didn't start golfing till she was in her 50s. She was always athletic and she was fiercely independent. She was also very involved in our family, loving my sons and grandchildren as if they were her own. Together, we took care of our father as he slowly died of a bleeding disease. Ellie cared for our mother as she disappeared into Alzheimer's disease. I could not help her at that time because I was caring for my husband, who was suffering from cancer and multiple treatments that caused him to deteriorate quickly with no ability to move or do anything. Not a good quality of life for a previously big, active, healthy man of 66. That was in 2001, before the MAID law. So when Ellie was diagnosed with cancer in 2016 at the age of 69, we had had a lot of experience with doctors, medical protocols, and dying. Yet we still did not discuss with her excellent oncologist and primary care physician what would happen with various treatments, and no options were mentioned besides chemotherapy, surgery, and radiation. And we didn't even think to ask, because our previous interactions with our parents And my husband, there were no other options besides treatments, and we wouldn't dare say no. And there was no other discussion about what a good quality of care would mean to my sister Ellie. Never came up. After a year, as she got sicker, my sister decided to stop her treatments, except for palliative care, which was very important, so she could function and say goodbye to her friends and her family and enjoy her last weeks. The End of Life Option Act had become a California law on June 9, 2016, and Ellie chose to use life in January 2018. We had done a lot of reading. We had followed other states. We had looked into Oregon's law. There are 10 other states and the District of Columbia, I believe it's 10, that now had the end of life law, medical aid and dying law, with many other state legislatures working on legislation. To her, good health and good life meant being independent and active, feeling well, and not being in the hospital a few times a week for palliative care. She wanted a good quality of life rather than an extension of what her life had become. And she was dying. She did not want to prevent a natural death, and she saw no reason to extend the dying process. Ellie died as she had planned, at home with her family. And it wasn't sad. I just get choked up now, remembering that I miss her. But we were actually laughing when she took the medication and she was in a coma very quickly, because she wanted a beautiful Reba McEntire song played on a loop on my son's phone, just like them horses. Reba's saying goodbye to her father. It was playing on a loop in the background for a while, because it took my sister, who was determined not to die that easily. But she was in a coma. We were listening to the music, hoping she could hear it. And it was actually very peaceful. It was actually lovely. She was prepared. We were prepared. She was so brave and strong to the end. And she died peacefully. And that was a blessing for her and for us.
Our last section really is to bring this into a Jewish context. And the problem with trying to do that is that, as you all have heard the joke and the story, that if you ask 4 rabbis, you can get 7 opinions, or maybe 9. And also, you're not supposed to go rabbi hunting to get the opinion that you want. You know, you go to the posek and you ask, and that's the answer. So if we look at the extreme on the Orthodox side, we have the idea that all treatment, all everything, sanctity of life, we have to do everything to preserve life. And then we move through the different traditions, and, you know, there are volumes, there are libraries on this subject. So I'm just going to relate 3 Talmudic stories that kind of have influenced where we are with end-of-life care now, as these try to get interpreted into what we can do today, right? Because they're ancient stories. And so the first one is Rabbi Judah the Patriarch. And Rabbi Judah was critically ill, and his students were all surrounding his home and praying for him to live. And his handmaid went up on the roof of the house. How many of you have been to Israel and seen what the old houses would have been like? Went up there and dropped a piece of pottery so that it fell and shattered and shut them all up so that he could die. And that's used now today often as an illustration and a conversation about why we don't have to pursue everything, that we can allow natural death, that we should not be preventing death that's going to happen anyway, and how critically important that has become for many Jews as a way to say, oh, wait a minute, I don't want that. Just this handmaid dropping her pottery. One of the other very famous stories has to do with a rabbi. I always pronounce his name screwy because of my own reading issues, but it's Hananiah. And he was being burned at the stake by the Romans, and they had him covered with wool pads that were moist to increase his suffering. And his people and his followers said, breathed in deeply the smoke. And sometimes, by the way, this story ends with this part, breathe in the smoke so you will die quickly. And he said, no, I cannot take my own life. And sometimes that's as far as, and that's used as an extreme reason of why you can't do that. And then people say, oh, that's the end. And they don't even tell the rest of the story. The rest of the story is that he asked to have the wool pads removed from him so that the fire would burn him more quickly. And this is used as an explanation for many people, especially on a more Orthodox tradition, and even some in traditional traditions, say that you can, once you've started something, you have to keep using it. And you can only just don't start the IV, don't start the ventilator, don't start the next bag of whatever, the next bag of pressors. And that way it falls more in another category, whereas this story suggests that we can remove. And it's the one that the conservative movement and the reform movement tend to rely on, with the idea that we can remove feed tubes, we can remove ventilators, we can not do this to people just because we can, that we don't have to pursue that. And then the last story is one that's considered very, very controversial in some circles. And that is King Saul, who fell on his sword. And it's the one that's often used by some rabbis in the Jewish community to say that it's okay to use MAID, to use medical aid in dying, that he did that to prevent himself from suffering. So, you know, there is in the Jewish tradition always, you know, we're not supposed to ever live in a community where there is no doctor. There is sanctity of life. There is pursuing healthcare, pursuing life. That is a primary tenet of our tradition, is sanctity of life. So the conversation about how life ends becomes very difficult in many, many circles. Very difficult for many people about how to deal with that when they hold that up and go, well, wait a minute, you know, we have to pursue life at all cost. And so it becomes very hard to say, I'm not going to do treatment. I'm not going to. And the various rabbis, and there are responsa, even within the conservative tradition, the two sides of these stories. Rabbi Elliot Dorff's is one, and I don't know who's the other. He's slipped my brain, but you know, there are volumes written of responsa with each one of the traditions that describe this. So a lot has to do with what tradition you're in, and how these Talmudic stories tell us about life today, with something that those people knew nothing about what we could do. And what we can do today is prolong life way beyond what's natural, way beyond what's natural, through all kinds of good and not so good means. I have somebody over here going, you know, it is remarkable what we can do. And so for us within the Jewish community to function in a world where these kinds of decisions are made at a medical perspective, not necessarily out of faith or necessarily out of what our belief systems are. It's very difficult. So these stories are the stories that are used in almost every single responsa as a way to talk about what's okay for us to do. And again, there's the spectrum from the very orthodox who will keep somebody on a ventilator and continue treatment way beyond the beyond, to people in the Jewish community today who are using MAID. And there is the spectrum. And at some point, maybe we'll do another conversation where we can talk more in depth about that, but we're really kind of up about time. And I want to give Ryan a last moment to say something. Oh, I want to add one other piece, and that is that the medical community has become ultra autonomy based. And so it's up to the individual to decide what they want. And one of the things that's really at the root of Judaism is we are communitarian. We are family, we are mishpacha, we are community. And so the level of decision making is very different than it would be with this is what I want. It's often what's good for family, what's good for people. So did you want to tie any knots on any of that?
Yeah, for what it's worth, I asked my rabbi and she said it's fine.
Well, the reform movement is much more likely to accept the Saul precedent, but the Orthodox and the traditional and some conservative rabbis are going to say, we don't even know who wrote that. They deny that the rabbi who wrote it. And, you know, there's always the way to push and pull. And so it depends who you go to and who your posek is that you ask for that advice.
Yes. So it's my final thoughts on this is that, you know, everybody dies, but everybody's death is personal and different and unique. And every individual is different and unique. And what drives you and what your own goals are for the end of your life is something that everyone should think about and might change too. People change their minds about things all the time as they near the end. And so it's something that it's important for us all to check in with ourselves about while we're still feeling well and once we start not feeling well, and not keeping those thoughts to yourself, discussing them with the people around you. And then I think now we're going to questions, right?
Very shortly.
Okay.
And I know there's a question in that back corner. I know.
Hold it.
You need to stand
You'll get
up.
a chance. Thank goodness. So thank you so much, Ryan and Meg. Very informative for those of us also. Yes. For those of us who have done homework, who have been through this with loved ones and friends, and we have an inkling of what you were talking about. It's so much to learn still. There's just so much to know. And it can be, as Ryan pointed out so many times, very confusing. From so many systems, very confusing. I'd now like to introduce Lynn Dean, attorney at law, who will facilitate questions from the floor. Please raise your hand and stand to ask your question. Lynn will repeat your question and the speakers will respond. We'll repeat so the people on Zoom can hear. Laurel Hollis is monitoring the questions on Zoom. After the Q&A, Lynn will tell you about our second session in February. Lynn?
Okay. I'm going to let you all take a deep breath because I am willing to bet that when you walked in the door today, you had no idea what this conversation was going to be about. And I congratulate you all for coming. I was watching all of your faces. I could see that you were totally paying attention to everything that was being said. This information is so important. Now, we can't emphasize enough how you really need to think about this and communicate your wishes with your loved ones and your family. I am an attorney. I'm an estate planning attorney. I've probably had this conversation with literally over 1,000 people as I help them prepare their healthcare directives. So I know that it's a tough topic. It's a tough topic to think about. But the better prepared you are, the more time you give this, the easier it's going to be for everyone who has the joy to help you in your end of life years. So that's my word of wisdom for you. I do have a couple of questions that came in on Zoom. You can write out a question rather than standing up to ask your question. I don't think my mic is going to go all the way to the back of the room. So if the person who has the question in the back wouldn't mind coming up, that would be great. Okay, so I have to rephrase the question or repeat it so the people at Zoom, in case they didn't hear you, will know what the question is. And so I think your question is, what is the difference between a medical power of attorney and a legal power of attorney? Is that right?
Correct.
Okay,
So a power of attorney is for finance and only for finance. And I can't tell you how often people will say, oh, I'm the power of attorney. And we'll say, can we see the document? Oh, you're for finance. and not power of attorney for healthcare designates somebody and then a second alternative if you cannot make your own decisions for whatever reason, or if you opt not to make your own decisions, let my decision maker do that because I'm confused. But so that's the difference between a power of attorney and a power of attorney for healthcare. And then an advance directive is usually a part of or could be attached to a power of attorney, durable power of attorney for healthcare, which gives more specifics about what you do or do not want. Okay.
yes.
A post is,
Wait.
Oh,
I
I'm
have to
sorry.
say the question.
Mhm.
So the question is, and as it was put, I'm very interested in a post. What is a post, and is it part of my medical documents that should be given to my physicians?
So a post is actually a physician order. And most people don't realize that. The bottom of it has to be signed by a physician. And it can be created by your loved one or by your power of attorney for healthcare. If you cannot, but it has to be part of your medical record. And hopefully wherever it was created is going to pass that on. It's in your it would be in your electronic medical record. And then that would get passed on to the various care providers as well as be in your home.
And I'm going to also share that it's very common for people to ask, once they have that post, where should I put this?
On the refrigerator.
On the refrigerator. Yep.
Well, you could also have a tattoo that says DNR right
No,
here.
you can't.
Yep, I've seen that.
Actually, I know nurses who have done that.
Yep.
And the thing is, it holds no more legal precedent to have a DNR tattooed on your chest than it does to have a living will. You really need to have
The document.
those documents. I know somebody who has a post that keeps his post. He's got a photocopy of it in his car so that if he's in a car wreck, they know he's got cancer and he doesn't want to be resuscitated. He says, if I die in a car wreck, leave me there. So.
Yeah, and
right.
just to underscore that PUL, it's a physician order. That's
Yeah.
what PUL stands for, is Physician
Physician's
Order
Order.
for Life-Sustaining Treatment. So
Okay, Mary,
please give a copy to your doctor.
Repeating that the pulse is for when you are in hospice, for when you have the end of a life terminal illness. It's not for earlier on.
Somebody, so the question was, sorry, the question was that she had heard that you don't have to have a life-threatening condition to have a pulse. And that's correct. It's mainly if you're filling it out in advance, so to speak. It's really if you want a DNR and you really don't want someone to resuscitate you because chest compressions, et cetera, not super effective at returning spontaneous circulation and returning you back to your pre-cardiac arrest self. By the way, little digression. I love that you brought up about like it should say, if I'm found and I'm dead.
Right.
Because actually when we take our CPR classes, they all talk in those terms, somebody being dead and how you can tell reversible death from irreversible death. And so it really should say that
Right,
on
it's
there
right.
because it frames it better for you when you're feeling this, oh, I'm dead at that point. Yes.
And I would like to add what Ryan just said is, the TV and TV shows,
Yeah.
medical shows make it sound like coding someone, resuscitating someone is highly successful and they get up and walk out. Well, unless somebody is otherwise healthy and just has a cardiac arrest, and there happens to be somebody right there who can do the resuscitation,
And shocks
it's
them
not,
immediately.
it's shocking, restarting the heart. It's not terribly successful.
Yeah.
People often end up on ventilators and then families have to make a decision to remove them. And if they're out for too long, well, not even very long,
Not even very long.
significant brain damage. So resuscitation is a question worth having and a conversation worth having with your physicians.
I'm going to ask you to hold that. I'd like to cover the questions that came in on the Zoom also. This is a question. How do you ensure the person that you designate on your advance directive is legally obligated to follow your wishes?
Mm.
You're gonna go for that one?
Gosh,
It is difficult.
it's difficult. And I mean, the short answer is you can't. I mean, the whole point is it's when you're not able to make the decisions for yourself, which is why you need to have that conversation with the person and say, are you sure that you're comfortable with this and you're going to follow my wishes? Because once you're out and that person's your designee, they actually don't have to follow the letter of what you
No.
told them.
Mm-mm.
But legally, they are speaking with your voice.
And it's one of the reasons that it's really helpful to have an attached advance directive to your durable power of attorney for healthcare, because then a physician could go in and say, Meg said this, and you're choosing this, and have that conversation. So it's helpful to have that extra documentation, but it can be very complicated if a person chooses not to follow. And it's really important, like Ryan said, to make sure that whoever you've picked to be your decision maker will do what you want, that they understand, that they accept, and they're willing to do that.
And I should also mention in California, if you don't have a durable power of attorney where you've designated a person, all the family members have equal weight for making the decisions. So imagine that for a moment.
So get your durable power. Now, in some states, there is a hierarchy of loved ones
But not
and
in California.
whatever. And it's not true here in California. And so you can imagine what the family dynamics that happen. It's really, you get somebody who doesn't want what you would have wanted, who has the loudest voice, right? So it's really important to fill out these documents.
Okay. I'm still with you, but I have one more question which ties in very well with what they were just talking about. which is this person asked, what happens when somebody doesn't have that designated person? The family wants to help the person who is very, very ill, but the person who is very ill is still competent, making her own decisions, and won't let anybody help her or make decisions for her.
Well, that's easy. So if somebody is mentally competent, so they're not unconscious, they're not delirious, they're not, et cetera, that person can make their own decisions for themselves if they're mentally competent.
The other word that's used is decision-making capacity. Because competency is really a legal term and a judge decides that. Whereas what doctors decide is whether or not somebody has decision-making capacity. And as long as somebody is deemed to have decision-making capacity, they get to make their own decisions. I have a patient right now that there's much of our staff who believes she does not. She is very confused and she changes her mind on a regular basis, but both doctors who have evaluated her, she has come up to the conversation and has been deemed to have decision-making capacity. So decision-making capacity is a big issue about who makes that. A judge deciding that you don't have competency would actually probably try to assign a conservator, and it's a whole nother set of issues.
All right, and without further ado, your turn. You. Okay, so for those of you on Zoom who might not have heard that, our guest was mentioning that her husband unfortunately passed away of a heart attack at age 47. And shortly after that, when she was able to have a conversation with her doctor encouraged her to do the Advanced Health Care Directive and the POLST and said, over time, you will probably change these documents, but just in case, it's important to have them in place.
Yes.
And
I agree with
that's
that.
why the original title of this was not just for older adults or something like that,
Mhm.
because this is conversations. I have a dear friend who's a nurse who her daughter and boyfriend they had graduated from college and were going off to Europe to whatever. And she said, okay, sit you guys down. What do you want? Something happens to you. Who's going to make your decisions? And what do you want? And this was to college age kids because she didn't know and she didn't want to have to make their decisions for them. So having these conversations fairly early on, anything can happen to any one of us. I have two 20-year-olds in hospice right now. And every age range all the way up to, we have one who's 105. So.
Yeah. And same thing for Aiden dying. I, unfortunately have people in their 30s.
Yes.
With greater frequency than I'm comfortable
Right.
with going through that process. And usually when I'm reviewing advanced directives at the Medicare wellness visit, I'm usually not just saying like, oh, good, you have one. I usually open it up and look at it and say, okay, is this, this is what I have. Is this still what you want? This is dated from 2018. So it's a little while back and it says Janine's your first decision maker, but I thought you and Janine broke up. Oh yeah. Okay. I better change that. So, it's important to not just fill them out, but review them every once in a while.
Yeah, in fact, my own mother and father had, because she was the loudest voice in the room and because she was the oldest, had picked my older sister. But my mother lived in the same state with my younger sister, and my younger sister became her caregiver. And my mother was afraid to take that back from the older sister. And the debate, the family dynamics that happened around the decision making for my mother were really sad. My mother ended up deciding that my younger sister, who since she was caring for her, but my older sister blew up. But we can change these things over time. Somebody passes away. There's somebody's no longer willing to make that decision for us. They can be changed. When I handed my current advanced directive that has my information on it to my doctor, he looked at it and he said, oh, can I have a copy of this? This is great because I get down to the nubbins detail of what I do and do not want in end of life. And he said, what do you do? Oh, I've seen way too much death, so I know what I want at the end.
We still have a couple questions and then. Okay, so the question is, what are the
Sure.
options? This is a
Okay,
great
yeah.
question, by the way. What are the options for someone who has Alzheimer's? If they didn't do documents ahead of time, is that correct? That they can't do once they have Alzheimer's? Is that your question? Okay,
Yeah, I can answer that. So there are a few things. So for instance, my father died last year from Alzheimer's, and I was his durable power of attorney for medical decisions. And he made it very clear to me from the time that I was young that he wanted everything done, no matter what was happening to him. He wanted to live every last breath that he could squeeze out of life. And so I honored that, even though I saw him deteriorating and really not looking great. But if that had not been his wishes, and he had told me instead, when I get to X point, I want you to let nature take its course. Then, for instance, when he got COVID, instead of admitting him to the hospital and getting him treatment, I could have just let him pass, which probably would have been more merciful than the final year that he ended up having of his life. But so you can make those kinds of distinctions known, that if you then get sick, that you don't want to have antibiotics, or you only want to have comfort directed measures, oxygen okay, oxygen not okay, things like that, to allow your body to pass more naturally, because we do a lot of things to people nowadays that extend their life beyond what it would have been able to 200 years ago. And so just not doing those things and letting someone pass is an option. Now, in terms of medical aid in dying, that is unfortunately not an option for someone who has Alzheimer's disease, because you do need mental capacity to make your own medical decisions. And you cannot put in an advance directive doesn't count. You can't say in an advance directive that if I am demented, I want to do aid in dying, because you having capacity when you wrote that document is not the same thing as you having capacity when you actually take the meds. You need capacity when you take the meds in this country.
So I would share an additional piece of that is when I met my husband, his advanced directive was basically do everything. And then he lived with me for a while as a hospice chaplain, and he has changed that. But it's very difficult, and the laws were specifically written around MAID the way they are written to prevent the possibility of somebody doing this to someone else or coercing somebody into doing it.
Yep.
So that if the person's disabled or if it's dementia, in some cases with ALS patients, some cases with MS patients. And so they don't have that option if they no longer can make their own decisions to do this. Because the law was written very carefully with a lot of input from the disability community to keep protections around how it's used.
Yeah.
So that it's not euthanasia, so that it's not us doing it to you or pressuring you to do it.
Yeah. There can sometimes be a fine balance between guardrails and barriers.
Yeah.
And striking a balance between those two things, because I get asked so often at large lectures, well, what about Alzheimer's?
Yeah.
What about dementia? You're leaving them out in the cold. Well, Parkinson, well, if you're demented at the end,
It depends.
it depends on how,
Which
yes.
kind of, where the Parkinson's is.
Yeah.
Because
And
Parkinson's has its own really interesting dementia that's very different. That's what
Yes.
my rabbi had.
So it was, there's a balance, and you know, a lot of this honestly has to do with what can we get legislators behind and being comfortable with in order to pass any law. And this is what we got.
And they're still fighting maids, so.
He wanted to make a comment.
Well, I wanted to say that after reset incoming.
Yep.
Yeah, my advance directive is very clear. If I can't feed myself and there's no hope of me recovering to a certain level, don't feed me. If I can't feed myself. And I have watched so many people, the reason that they are still there, and the family will say, I don't understand why he's still here. And I've watched them go, come on, you know, and get them to eat, and it prolongs things. And so that whole decision around eating, that can be part of an advanced directive that can help. And it's not necessarily be said in the sense that it's not voluntarily doing it yourself and refusing it all the time. But many dementia patients have no interest in eating anymore and don't eat. And we practically force feed them. We used to shove feed tubes down them, which we don't do so much anymore. Here, Florida still does it a lot.
We won't talk about Florida.
What?
I said we won't talk about Florida.
No, there was a question. Oh,
There's a couple more questions, but then we are at the end of our allotted time. Yes.
no, you can't. You cannot have somebody who would be caring for you medically be that decision maker. I can tell you that my husband and I are in a situation where we don't have anybody easily who would make those decisions for us. His children, my siblings, I don't particularly, after the fight with my mother, want them making my decisions or fighting over me. We actually have hired or have a fiduciary, a care provider agent who is our second on all of our documents, who has agreed to follow the instructions that we have given. And they are out there, various agencies and various organizations who are willing to do that.
There is an organization called the California Licensed Private Fiduciaries.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things we'll talk about in our next session.
But
February,
they are very,
February 11th.
I found out about them, I have to tell you, only because of my work, because I saw them caring for our patients. And it was like, oh, you're not family. Who are you? And that's how I found out about it. And it's not common knowledge. So.
Right. Yes, last one. The question is, if you have other insurance, right? But not Medicare
Yes,
Part B?
most insurances cover hospice. You don't have to be Medicare age. And I mean, there's pediatric hospice, most insurances do cover hospice. But it's worth checking with your insurance company to be sure.
Right. Okay, the question is, if the designated decision maker is very emotional and is not necessarily making, in the rest of the family's opinion, good decisions, is there anything that can be done about that?
Well, again, this is the reason that we have two decision makers, that you pick a first and a second, and then a doctor would need to decide that that person who you think was confused or whatever didn't have decision-making capacity at that time, and then it would go to the second person. That's why it's really important to have that second person, because it's not uncommon that somebody has put their spouse as their first, and their spouse, by the time this happens and they haven't written their advance directive, either has their own emotional issues or has dementia, early dementia or whatever, and can't make those decisions. I have to tell you, it is sometimes not best to have your family be that decision maker. Sometimes it's best to have it be somebody else. And that being a close friend, or that being a sibling or something. But that's why it's important to have two.
And just to clarify, you would only go to that second if the doctor felt like the
Right.
first didn't have decisional capacity,
Right.
but you couldn't actually wrest it away from
No.
them if you just feel like they're making a
No.
bad decision.
Yeah, because it is a
Because
court.
legally it is their decision. Well, but emotionally invested and so not making a good decision is different than lacking decisional
Yeah.
capacity. So when somebody is acting when my dad was demented and I was acting on his behalf as the durable power of attorney for medical decisions, legally I was him. Like I was him making those decisions. So just like a doctor couldn't come to me and say, I don't like the decision you're making, so I'm just going to ignore your decision. The doctor can't do that to the durable power of attorney just because they don't like the decision they're making. They have to not have capacity. So, I ask them probing questions and I find that their judgment is not intact. That's the only way that I can then say, I'm going to disregard you. And I wouldn't say it like that, but disregard them and then go to the second. Yeah.
Okay. In conclusion, come back for our next session in February 11th. We have given you those little yellow forms. They're in with your programs. We are really interested in finding out what you want to know more about. I'm going to talk next time as an attorney about some of the forms that we've mentioned here today, healthcare directives, 5 wishes, pulse, those kinds of things. I think we're also going to talk about options in terms of where you go for care, how you find a fiduciary, what is a fiduciary. I might bring a fiduciary with me next time so you can actually see one who walks and talks and breathes and find out what they do or what their view of their job is, because I work very closely with one on a daily basis. So there are still more things to know. We learned a lot today, I think, but there is still a lot we don't know and a lot to explore. Thank you so much for participating in today's session. We are really glad you joined us.
And I just want to thank Brian. He and I went out to lunch one day and and we knew that we could do this dance together and not feel like we were cutting one another. And it's just been a joy to spend this time with him and be able to do this process together. Thank you, Ryan.
It was a match made in heaven and by NCJW and the Jewish Family Service.
Yes, and thank you, Lydia, for putting this on.
Yeah, thank you, Lydia.
So in closing, thank you, Lynn, and we all look forward, I hope all of you do, we certainly look forward to February 2024. We're already planning. And to all of you for your excellent questions, and a big thank you to Meg and Ryan for their informative answers. Don't move yet. I'd like to thank Eileen Jacobowitz, who's in the back, the NCJW president of the Sacramento section, for suggesting the aging topic many, many months ago. And thank you to our speakers for sharing their time and expertise with us today. Thank you to my dedicated committee members, Marion Leff, Lynn Dean, Susan Abrams, Laurel Hollis, and Sheila Wolf, who made the planning so enjoyable working together. It is definitely a team sport. Thank you to Nella, the genius designer who printed our wonderful materials, and to Rick Snyder for his technical knowledge and help. And one last thank you to Congregation Beth Shalom for the use of such a comfortable, bright, sunny space. Please leave your yellow sheets of survey questions on your seats, and thank you for your feedback. There are 2 lists. Megan, Ryan, did you put together the 2 lists of, you were going to, oops, we'll get it to you because we have in the follow-up email that will go out to you. Thank you for being here. There will be links to various organizations that for healthcare, for caregiving, resource materials. You'll get some resource links to the forms and the End of Life Option Act law if you'd like to read it. And so we'll see you, I hope, February 11th, 2024 for the legal information balancing the medical. And you'll hear more about medical, I'm sure, because they're intertwined. And this will concern wise aging and end-of-life planning. So thank you. Goodbye. One more very important thing. We have a lot of materials on a table in the foyer. And these are for Compassion and Choices. They are free. You can go on their website and you can get all of this or download it, or they'll send it to you. And this book is full of forms, those important forms that give you real good details on how to fill them out. And there are other forms as well. So help yourself to those. Thank you.